what we're doing differently effectively is being able to go and digitize how you design these things, digitize how you assemble them, and then being able to take that feedback and build a better thing, and making this closed loop cycle of you're constantly improving your designs without having to blow up your supply chain.
You started studying at college, kind of manufacturing. You've then gone into the likes of Virgin Orbit, into the manufacturing industry, into the space industry now. I find it interesting because a lot of people kind of waver with their careers and they try something and they jump ship and they try something new. Yours seems like relatively linear in progression. Have I got that right? Or would you kind of add to that story at all?
Yeah, for the most part. But I'll just go into it. But my name's Oluseun Taiwo, co-founder and CEO of Solideon, or you can just call me Olu. Olu's a lot shorter. But basically, since I was a kid, I've had this crazy, I'd call it not even a love, almost like a lust for aerospace and just things that fly fast, and the idea of humanity actually getting to use our full potential, which is the solar system. And so I remember when I was like really young, my dad took me to a space shuttle launch, and I saw like that. We were kind of a little late to it, but I could see like the little orange trail, like going into the clouds and into the sky. And I was just so stoked on it. And so, studied really hard to go into university. I always wanted to be a pilot, but really, studied hard to go to university and be an engineer. Started as mechanical engineering, and I'm not going to lie, the classes were challenging. It was definitely difficult. And I switched over to manufacturing engineering because there was this idea. I remember that, one of the professors in mechanical engineering was telling me, and he was telling me that like the world needs really good mechanical engineers, but they also need people that are able to translate these crazy designs and actually manufacture them, right? And I think that stuck with me. And so as I switched my major just to find something that I think I was more passionate about, I got super excited, right? The actual fabrication technology, the way that the systems that keep things into place and how you make them, I think that was really cool. And during university, I had this really great chance to work with this amazing professor. Funny enough, it was the same mechanical engineering professor. He had a little 3D printing lab at the university. And this was like, 2015, before like Additive was huge, right? But it was not just like a bunch of small like toy 3D printers. These were like massive industrial 3D printers. So we were printing metal and doing research for the Air Force. And then they also had this huge like plastic neon 3D printer. I mean, this thing was the size of a small SUV. And it could print really large parts. And so I remember like after classes, like that would be what I did to like, they had to literally kick me out. It's like, I'll go do the research thing so I can earn the money to help pay for sort of my way through a school. And then I then would go to the plastic printer and play with different geometries and designs and work with different student groups on what they could actually work on. And so I was actually, my professor kind of understood that I was actually more interested on doing less of the research and more of the manufacturing for student projects and SAE and some of those other things. And so he had this crazy idea of letting me take on a project where basically a professor's daughter didn't have a right arm. Like she played violin, but she was born without a right arm. So he's just like, just create a prosthetic or whatever. And so through that process of a year and a half of creating a custom prosthetic and working with this person, I think there's like some alarm bells in my mind that's like 3D printing is going to change the world. Whatever I do after school, I want to be involved in that. And so I remember it was my last like year of school, and I was super and that's the working on that prosthetic got like a lot of national acclaim. Like it was on NBC and a bunch of other things. I gave a TED talk for a university about 3D printing and just like my jovialness for it. But I remember my last year of school, I was like, okay, I'm going to do that more often. And so I applied. I wanted to leave Illinois because that's where I went to school. I applied to 50 to 100 places at the time. And all of them, except one of them, rejected me. And that was Rocket Lab. And they're like, yeah, we know you have a little bit more of school to do. If it's possible for you to finish school online, for the little bit, because, you're a senior engineering student, come by and help us figure out how we use 3D printing to make rocket engines. And I was like, sold. So my parents and I, we flew from Illinois to California to go and check out this place. It was very real. And at the time, Rocket Lab was such a small name and they had raised such little funding in early 2017, where it was like, yeah, this is probably not, it might not amount to much. SpaceX at the time was starting to ramp up and things, but I think I could see I could see, like, I got to meet like some of the founding team for that company beyond Peter Beck. And like just getting time to talk with them and see their vision of how they were going from an empty warehouse to it was going to be filled with rocket engines and eventually full rockets. And I was like, I want to do that. So I remember I moved and I went to the factory. And it was probably the hardest job. I was only there like just at or under a year, but it's the hardest job I think I've ever done in my life. And not necessarily because the engineering work was hard, but because when you're a small startup and your first real job outside of school, like as an engineer, is a startup, it's like a tricky place, man. Like there's like real stakes on the line. There's like I was employee number 15 at the US Rocket Lab, so really early on, and there was like really just difficult things to figure out as to how to be like, if people don't play their parts well, like we will go out of business. Like your impact directly affects the team and also the long-term success of that company. And so I got to work on some of the most amazing projects as an engineer, figuring out how we're going to actually do things like print an entire rocket engine in a day. It definitely wasn't possible when I started, but by the time I left and even where Rocket Lab is now, they are doing it. They're probably one of the few people in the aerospace industry that I would say is actually successful at that. And that like hard mantra and that hard work of getting to build something amazing like that really, I think that really like dawned on me, and it made me excited to be like, I don't know if I'm necessarily going to build a company similarly to this, but the characteristics of how I saw Peter Beck just grind his butt off to make a vision that big and wide that competes with Elon succeed, that's kind of what stuck with me. And so I knew like I loved 3D printing and I loved spaceflight and I loved being an engineer. So I then went to go be an early stage employee at Virgin Orbit, where it was a similar job of learning how to use 3D printing to make really big rockets, rocket engines and different pieces of the rocket. Virgin, I would say, obviously I stayed longer at Virgin, but it was a little, it was, both places were challenging, but Rocket Lab, I'd say, was harder because of the fact we were the first company to do it. No one else put a fully 3D printed rocket engine into space. So it's like, how do you qualify that? How do you even test that? Blah, blah, there's so many thoughts, but at Virgin, it was they'd seen the success that companies like Rocket Lab or SpaceX have had. And so it was like, we have the funding, let's go and scale manufacturing to actually make bigger engines from 3D printing. And that's really where that's really kind of where I started getting some thoughts around maybe building this company. But hopefully that wasn't a crazy long intro here, but that's those two companies really shaped my thinking in using 3D printing and additive manufacturing to make whole products. Seeing the problems that we faced at both places really kind of directed me to where I'm at today.
No, that's amazing. Thanks so much for that great detail. I think there's obviously a lot to unpack there, but it does feel like, you started with that childhood passion and you just built in it. Mm-hmm. And, reading between the lines there, kind of talking to the right people, going to the right companies and being alongside these leaders that can actually help guide you and inspire you. Other than kind of like the hard work of obviously watching these guys trying to compete with the likes of Elon, what would you say were like your biggest lessons from each of Rocket Lab and Virgin?
I would say probably what I had to learn, it's probably not as like engineering or scientific here, but I think like personal balance is like a huge thing. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's like, it's very easy to let to let a vision suck you in and you go, there's nothing wrong with working 50 or 60 hours a week. That's like normal now or maybe even more, right? But it's more like personal balance. And like, if you're going to engage in doing that and working like really like segmented and just all in, like figure out ways to take care of yourself during that time. So at Rocket Lab, I think they were too young to help figure that out. Like we just weren't, I think it was like, there's times and seasons where you have to just pedal to the metal and you worry about things later. But at Virgin, the company culture was very, it was very interesting. It was like they would bring in like catered like lunches and dinners and even breakfasts depending on the shifts and things like that. So it's like, okay, at least you were going to work, like 60, 70 hour week. You didn't have to worry about groceries.
Did it feel like kind of a bit bigger and more corporate and maybe less like a scrappy startup?
Yeah, it did, which I have my thoughts on it. I'm not going to say anything about that today or maybe ever. But I think what was interesting, it was two companies trying to do very similar things and just had different approaches to it. So Virgin's was like people first, we're going to take care of that. In the process, they spent quite a bit of money trying to do that, but people generally were happy, but maybe didn't feel the urgency. At Rocket Lab, every day was a sprint marathon, and it felt like you were at the Olympics, but we had to because we knew we had a little finite time to be market leaders. We didn't have the backing of Richard Branson at Rocket Lab. And so I think just understanding and making sure I didn't lose myself in that. And there were many times where I had to check in and be like, hey, buddy, what are we doing here? How do we make sure you're taken care of? I think that was a huge lesson learned. I think the other lesson learned that I learned is when you build a startup, there are good leaders who are good at communicating a vision. And there are leaders who can be the most amazing people, but they're not great at communicating the vision. But how you communicate where you're going as a company and your openness and your honesty with that is how your people respond. And so obviously I've worked under really great leaders in the aerospace industry that were going to take, some of the biggest risks to try to even steal some of, Falcon 9's market share. And some of them did really well communicating where we were going in a growth plan, and some didn't, right? But what mattered is understanding how I felt and then talking to my colleagues. And these are some of the most best technical people I've ever worked with. Some of them came directly from working with Elon to go build some of the best propulsion systems ever in humanity so far, right? So these are not just random people that were my age. These were everyone was always older than me. That's the other funny thing about working at these companies. But these people, these were people who have been in the rodeo. It's not like it's their first, show of trying to build something incredible, but how they reacted to clear communication and good leadership on directionality versus not. It didn't matter how talented they were. They're people at the end of the day. They got frustrated like everyone else. They would get excited. They would be all in, or they would be this is not super fun for me. So it was just interesting to see, professionals, they are professional. They'll work their dime. But for a lot of people, especially even myself, it's like they didn't come to this job to just be silenced and work, a ton of hours. It's like we're trying to take humanity somewhere geographically it's never been before, right? That should be that was their driving force for them. And it's interesting to see when they didn't feel like they were being communicated clearly to, how if that would just that could crumble, or it could help build that momentum for them. So
you've seen startups fall apart over that kind of thing, right? You see co-founders split up. I know personally and have worked with startups that you kind of get the sense of you could be moving a lot faster and you could achieve a lot more if you just have better communication. And I think this is probably, maybe not in the hardware space where you guys operate, but this is probably something that's happening a lot in software, where everyone kind of gets spread all over the world, primarily due to kind of COVID accelerating remote work from home trends, and that communication is a little bit slower. You kind of introduce that little bit more of a red tape. You can expand the team for sure, and you can take it international, but by doing that, you're actually slowing down all of the communication channels, and it can become a little bit of a bottleneck and a little bit of a stranglehold. So I really appreciate that insight. Let's get to your company then, because obviously you're in the additive manufacturing space. Immediately, anyone who's familiar with kind of the space industry would start to think, Relativity, space, Tim Ellis and this and that. Is he someone you kind of looked up to and was inspired by as well? And maybe frame your startup in terms of what you do and perhaps what you do differently to Relativity.
Yeah, it's good. I will say one thing, and then I'll try to refrain from speaking directly. I'm a huge fan of Tim and Jordan, both of them. So I had a really cool opportunity when I was leaving Rocket Lab to go be one of the first 20 employees at Relativity. So they literally had reached out to me. One of the really early hiring engineering managers reached out to me and wanted to interview for me. I declined it at the time because I had my headset somewhere else. But following that company, I loved it. Let's just say one of the rocket companies that I had worked for, they were like, this is never going to work. They're kids. They don't know what they're doing. And in my mind, I was always like, yeah, they're going to show you. In my mind, I'm like, this makes too much sense for someone not to have done this in a way. And I'm like, I can't wait till it just opens up the aperture, so to speak, of a really innovative company that's doing great things. I would say both of those guys are huge fans for me. I've gotten to meet one of them in person and was a huge fan of, once again, of both of them and the innovation. But in my company, I think it's the most flattering thing that we could ever be compared with those two guys, with that company. Really, Relativity literally was the first advantage mover when it came to building an entire rocket, right? Like, obviously, I'm a huge fan of 3D printing, so there's no way that I wouldn't. But for our company, I think, yeah, there are lessons that we've taken from them that we're learning in building ours. And one of them is we have a big vision, which is great. But understanding that the market conditions are different from when they raised is important, right? So we don't have Mark Cuban money, right? That is invested in us. We went to Techstars, but we didn't go through Y Combinator, right? And Techstars, I would argue, is equally as strong as Y Combinator. But I guess what I'm trying to say is one of those things is understanding when you have a big vision to get somewhere, right? You especially when the time in the market is not slightly, it's definitely different from when they raise that much, billions of dollars. I think what I've learned is to understand, even if we're trying to get to the same place as a company like that, we have to take a different approach to being able to manage how we get there now, right? So for us, at Solideon, right, we're using very innovative robotics and 3D printing at, let's just say, a scale of 20 feet or larger. This will be you'll be able to see the things very easily that we're making from our technology. But instead of focusing on a rocket, right, which costs tons of money, like literally you saw billions to go and get, not billions, but close to $1 billion to get Terran 1 up and ready and hiring a team of 1,000 people. It's like in today's day and age, I have to figure out a way to reach similar growth to do that awesomeness with less capital, right? Or not even less capital, maybe harder access to capital, right? Because we're in an economic downturn right now. So one of the things is that we're doing differently is we're saying if that end goal is to go build these really cool products, right? How do we become B2B manufacturing platform that people want to build with us on? So it builds up our build case to go from building an entire thing immediately to being able to do that in 2 to 3 years, right? And so that's the goal. And I think that's what I learned from Relativity. It's like, I'm not Tim Ellis, right? I'm amazing, right? I like to say that to myself. I'm amazing, but I'm not that amazing at raising capital, right? So I have to know my limitations and understand how I can get us to a similar spot with just more tricks up our sleeves. And so right now for our company, we're less focused. We have a vision of building our own products and services, but we're more focused on serving and fixing the problems that exist in the aerospace supply chain right now. We're kind of, we've seen what Relativity has done. The whole world has seen that printing an entire rocket has its advantages and disadvantages. And so for us, we're less focused on the rocket piece and more of the other pieces in the aerospace supply chain of things that are really big, like massive things, right? But they need that level of innovation that 3D printing and digital engineering can bring. We're kind of still in the dark ages if you look at how things like hypersonics or even, things like, let's just pause on hypersonics, things that hypersonics eventually will be the thing that gets humanity off this rock into other planets. And the way we make those super crazy advanced designs is so slow with like thousands of vendors, and it's super pricey, and it's literally a huge workforce to work on parts. Like it's almost like an ant colony trying to build like an entire like a big hive. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to have a massive workforce to get that to work. And so for me, I was kind of like, that's just not how we're going to build in space. We need to take that approach to fixing like aerospace supply chain issues now. And if we're working on advanced programs and projects right now, this is the best time to bring in this detailed level of building to build innovative products. It makes sense to me. It's like the more advanced stuff we're building on decades old manufacturing platforms, like the harder and more expensive it's going to be. It's like a scale problem. It's like you're just not going to be able to scale like easily to make things. And so right now is the time, I think, to kind of introduce this level of building things beyond just building our own stuff. I think the market's responding really well to building with 3D printing at scale. So.
No, I love it. And again, a lot to unpack there. I definitely want to come back to kind of the fundraising side of things. But I think it's really interesting what you mentioned about the supply chain. If you could just kind of dig a bit deeper into that in terms of, what the current problems are and how we even go about solving it. Because, to an outsider, a lot of people thinking, most of the innovation in the supply chain space at the moment is just kind of like software platforms and this and that. How do you put that into the context of space and aerospace? Because, there's so many players, there's some contractors, some direct manufacturers, suppliers, all these different players. How do you begin to go about solving that problem? And do you think that one company actually can kind of bring it all together?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question. I don't think I'll answer that last question first. I don't think that just one company can do it. I think it's going to be probably 5 to 10 of them. And that's a good thing, right? Competition breeds innovation, and innovation breeds amazing production and processes. In aerospace, one of the hardest things to do is to go. It sounds so dumb. It's going to be like, of course, a yeah type of thing. But to go from an idea to fly it is really difficult, right? It's not even just the design and the analysis piece of it. Now you have to go validate that through every piece and process. So let's say I'm making, for example, a rocket, right? People just look at it. It looks like one just long tube of carbon fiber metal. It's like, actually, there's multiple tubes of that. And inside that is like propulsion systems, the avionics. And inside that is you have to have the wiring harness, all this stuff, right? Even if you're a company like SpaceX, they are pretty vertically integrated on the Falcon 9 program. And that's about 75, 85. I will give them the higher end would be almost 90% vertical integration, right? Other companies, once again, do not have Elon's money, flight pedigree. And that's not just space. That's just in aerospace, right? So it doesn't matter what startup. You could be talking about an eVTOL company, or you could be talking about a rocket company, right? So because you're not as vertically integrated, that means that all these pieces downstream, you have thousands of vendors that have to make things for you. You have to put it together. You're kind of like I call it like the puzzle piece assembler at your factory, right? You have to go and puzzle piece it together, go test it. And then once you get data that tells you, oh, we're not as efficient in this certain area as we thought we were, you have to go back to your other vendors and get them to remake stuff. And that long cycle time is just like, it's like the most frustrating thing in the world, because like you're not actually getting to do the thing, which is to go fly it and make money, right? That's the goal of any rocket company, right? And I'm using rockets for an example because it's the one I know the best, right? But rocket companies, like, you can sign like launch agreements with satellites and other end use customers, right? They might even give you a portion of the money up front, but you have a huge operation to go make the dang rocket that gets to space. And you don't actually make that money until like you launch, right? So you don't make money on the iterative cycles. You might make a little bit of money and you have to raise a ton of VC funding for some of your earmarked places, right, of things that you've achieved, but you don't actually make a ton of money until you actually do what your product's supposed to do. Go figure. And so that I think I've looked at that and I've seen, like, for example, Rocket Lab has survived that and it's done well. Virgin Orbit didn't, and they're not around anymore, right? But I think that start to finish, it's like my mind has always been like, and especially working and seeing how hard people work, it's like, how can we literally shorten that idea to flight, and then an even better thing, and then make an even better thing once you learn until you have this really great product in the time of basically doing traditional aerospace manufacturing. It's like, how do you build 7 things that have tested and flown versus just the one thing that you're now 70% surety on its first flight might win. And so I think for us, I'm losing track of the question here, but I think for us, we're trying to build a company where if you're using digital engineering and robotics to not only help you print a really big thing, but also use that same robotics to actually help you assemble things into itself, and you're designing things in almost like it's like an almost living working environment of design engineering, right? That's really the core of what we're doing. We're saying, when you change something, how does it affect everything downstream? How do we think that way? And the only way we know how to do that is through digital engineering, where you can build a software piece that enables you to look at a whole system, right? How is it manufacturable from day one? As we're designing the dang thing, how do you actually manufacture it, right? With the tools that are available to me, not with getting other tools. But let's say if I have a certain confined box, right, or so to speak, or certain confined rules on how you design something, how does that affect how you assemble it? How does that affect how you design it? How does that even affect how you fly the dang thing? And that's really where additive manufacturing for us is huge and comes in, right? Like this technology has the possibility of many different combinations and permutations to build a whole subset of things you and I, James, have never seen before, right? Especially at the larger scale, at relativity scale, products have never been printed that large before. But if you have companies like ours that are introducing that technology and we're actually able to have modern day computations to help us solve some of those really hard problems in additive in terms of design, we'll start to build products that like no one has even dreamed of yet. And that's what's really cool, right? Is because our bet is that those bigger products that we're using computations to help us solve, not only are going to help us produce things faster, half or less the supply chain, right? But it's also going to be higher performing potentially, right? And that's what's key here. And so for us, right, rockets are interesting, but it was the wrong application because, and you saw a 3D printed rocket looked pretty much like a normal rocket, right? But when you're talking about things that can be redesigned like hypersonics, where there's not an idea, we didn't have an idea for a starting point on what a hypersonic plane should look like, or even let's talk fusion energy. Right, where it's like you just have a problem at this point and you're trying to find anything that can solve and kind of bridge those ideas. The idea of being able to build it faster with less supply chain and at a cost that's at or below traditional manufacturing. I mean, who's going to want to not pay that? Like that's literally like the future. So for us, what we're doing differently effectively is being able to go and digitize how you design these things, digitize how you assemble them, and then being able to take that feedback and build a better thing and making this closed loop cycle of you're constantly improving your designs without having to blow up your supply chain. So
that's the best part of additive manufacturing, right? Just that kind of quick, rapid prototyping, kind of bringing the world of the startup, the speed and the agility of a startup to the hardware world, which is obviously very hard to do. Again, thank you for giving so much detail. I'd love to hear more about kind of, the fundraising aspect. You made a really good point there about the kind of a lag between, getting your customers on board and actually having, revenue that you can book versus trying to get the funding. And I imagine there's just this kind of constant cycle of trying to convince VCs and investors of like, we'll get funding, we'll get kind of revenue in the future, but like, please fund us now kind of thing. Can you maybe start from point A and talk about how you got your first customers and how you managed to get them on board? Have you booked any revenue yet, for example? Because from kind of what I'm reading between the lines here is that, yes, you're talking a lot about space and rocketry, but actually additive manufacturing is a whole bigger TAM, right? It's a huge market out there. You're talking about digital transformation and this and that. You could work with any kind of manufacturer and give them value through your 3D printing, essentially. So, talk to me maybe to frame it well. Did you have a customer that came to you asking for a certain requirement, and how did you fulfill that requirement?
Yeah, totally. So we'll not, we'll not give out specific names here, but we have revenue bookable for between now and the next 3 or 4 months with an aerospace customer, and we're super stoked on that. But I think the way that we've approached VC fundraising, it's hard, right? It's like customers don't want to be the first shot, right, on goal for you of giving you money, right? Because they're like, well, you haven't even been funded yet, so we need to see VC investment, right? And then VC investment's like, well, if there aren't customers, right, like how do I understand that your valuation for your company and what you're bringing to the table makes sense? There are some, I will admit, that are bigger moonshots, VCs that are like, you know what, like you have a cool idea, here's money. But even those guys understand that they have to be able to make money back here. So for us, it was, we got really lucky. We did what most companies didn't do, and I'll kind of go into the story, but I quit my job August of last year. Literally that same week, I think actually the next day, we cold emailed like 60 investors. Like we literally, like me and my co-founder went on Google and we typed up people investing in space tech and aerospace. And there was the list there. Literally, we don't know how we got the emails, but we emailed everyone and no one responded to us except one investor from Techstars. And Techstars was, they had already closed their applications because they were starting the class, the class of 2022 in September 11th. And so we were like, we didn't even know what Techstars was. We're just like, we hear these people might give $150K check. That's all we need to kind of validate what we're doing. And so literally the guy responded to us that same day. He asked us to do pitch the next day. Me and my co-founder were both like deep engineers. So like we were like putting together slides that were different colors and didn't even like make sense. But what I will say is that I think what happened was we were very passionate when we presented that next day about where we were going. We talked about really innovative companies, and because of him and I actually our industry and experience, we knew the actual pain points and issues here. And so that same day, we got an offer from Techstars, literally. So 24 hours from contacting them to having that meeting, they gave us our first check in our company, which was 150K, which was huge for us. And the reason that was huge for us, I would say, is because Techstars is one of those investors where it's not just I'm giving you money because our company was so early when we went through that whole, I don't know, it felt like a 4 or 5 month process, probably closer to 4 months. But what was interesting is they talk so much about how revenue builds you. You know, investors look for a trend, right? Not just dots that are sort of sporadic here, right? So you need a trend line over time to convince someone to give you money. And so Techstars put us in the room with people like AFRL, for example, NASA JPL, a bunch of other customers, because they're so connected as a VC firm. The value that they brought me, other than giving us money to go and build our company, really was to go and connect you with end users and end users early, right? People who can be like, if you build that, I want to pay for it. And so we focused on building at first our company was slightly different in our focus, but we focused on building value to people who are like, I'd pay you a lot of money if you could do X, Y, and Z. And getting that customer discovery while we weren't hurting for money actually helped us a lot, I would say. Those are the tight-knit I would say tight-knit relationships that we worked with now, right? Where you can have a low, I can't actually think of the word, like a conversation that's a low stakes conversation, right? Where people don't feel like you're trying to sell them and that you're being annoying, right? Where you can just literally talk like through their problems, doing that without the urgency of I have a huge team and I'm burning like $10,000 an hour or something crazy like that if I don't have a customer. I think that was really key for us is we Techstars, people could see it as it was a holding pattern for our company, but it was really like when you plant a seed and you don't see the seed sprout for a while. All of a sudden it has this like beautiful fruit. So that's really how we both raised VC funding and customer interactions, where a lot of the customers working with came from that time of they went from, oh my gosh, we have to talk to these guys, to no, we have a personal relationship with them. They're building something that actually makes sense for our company. Like, let's get on board with that and work with them, because they know us as human beings and not just people trying to sell them. And that's huge for us. Like, and in manufacturing, there's, like you said earlier, there's many choices on not just different companies, but different additive manufacturing companies that exist, right? And our goal was to not build necessarily an additive manufacturing company, but more of a digital manufacturing company, a very new business model where it's almost like you have a factory for hire for large scale aerospace, where you're not just printing a thing and shipping it off, you're making an entire product versus a part. And that's a very different kind of business model to 3D printing right now. 3D printing is all about the generative, beautiful parts. And we're like, how do we take an entire system, print where it makes sense, and assemble things into that thing? And so we were very customer driven, and that helped us, I think, raise funding. Also, the Techstars network doesn't hurt either. So yeah.
No, I love it. Thanks so much for like really eloquently kind of bringing together the customer and the fundraising aspect, because they are so closely interlinked, right? I think as everyone listening surely knows, and it is all about the relationships as well. And you did a really great job of explaining how you kind of plant that seed with Techstars, you get your big break, so to speak, and it slowly blossoms out in terms of getting more funding and more customers as well. And obviously, fundraising, particularly if we call it deep tech or hardware companies, is a lot harder typically than it is for software. Are there kind of like any preconceptions that you had going in that got shattered, or maybe any curveballs that investors threw at you? I'm particularly talking about the fundraising process here.
Yeah. Good question. I think the thing for me that was surprising is if someone, just like the different lingo that investors like use. Like, I wish like that time from when I started Techstars to talking to investors, I wish like I had read a book on VC like lingo or something on how they think. It's investment has a different language. It's the way that I equated it. I remember like kind of journaled a little bit about it during Techstars. It's like I'm trying to speak German to somebody, and they're speaking like straight up like Dutch is too close to it, but Spanish, right? It's like a different language where you can kind of hear some similarities from a Latin language, right? But like that's it, like so. But what's interesting is like you still hear people talking. So the more you hear them say a certain thing, you start to figure out what that means. So for us, like it's like your company's too early. We love what you're doing, but you're too early. You're too early, or whatever. Funny enough, every VC except for say for maybe two people said that to us, and then but they still gave checks to us later on. I had to understand what that meant. So I think after the fourth or fifth time of hearing that, I'm like, what does that even mean? What does too early mean? And I remember I had an investor who was kind enough to sit down with me and help me talk about what that meant for them and what that probably means for another person. And I think getting that coaching where I started to think through how they think through investments at the early stage, what are they looking for? And so it's things like talking about market size intelligently and believably, right? It's things like, okay, if you don't have revenue, what is the path to revenue? Okay, it's down to the last penny. How are you going to spend my dollars, right? And how long does that take you through it? Things that, like, once again, you might have worked at a startup before, but you don't have to think through that. Your job is to go and operate on promise of being an engineer, right? In my case, when I worked for, Rocket Lab or Virgin, right? But now when you're actually at the helm of the ship and you're having these conversations yourself, you have to start speaking that language and it's not like VC is like ignorant or anything. It's just like the way it's made, it's like you have to speak their language and understand what they mean. And if you don't, it is going to be not impossible, but it's going to be really hard for you to break in into getting a check. So I very quickly, I was like, okay, I'm going all in. So halfway through my Techstars process and program, I just started to hang out with VCs. Techstars is really great with doing happy hours and things like that. I was like, you know what, we could, my co-founder was really focused on customer and the products that we were building. And I was like, let me talk to the people who we need their money to survive as a company post this program. And so spending time with them helped build a personal relationship, but it also helped me understand VC language and what people want. And not in the way of you say what they want to hear, but in the way of like, let me build up to a plan that is inclusive of what they want. And that's truthful, right? Always truthful, never just just a gimmick. So that's how we spend our time doing that. Hopefully that answers your question.
I can relate to that so much, man, because I used to work in finance for a couple of years, and it's like everyone, they literally speak in jargon 24/7, right? And it takes you so long to cotton on. And when you finally cotton on, you're like, okay, you're kind of making this seem like an 8 out of 10 kind of problem or issue. And it's like a 2 out of 10. It's like, why are you blowing, that kind of concept of, it's funny with the finance. I obviously don't want to disparage the industry too much, but it does feel like, I had people who work on like Wall Street equivalent in London in finance, this kind of stuff. And it's like almost like they do want to keep it like a closed kind of club where everyone understands, everyone's, you're either in or you're out. And I think that's very hard sometimes for founders, particularly when you're highly technical. Maybe you're an engineer, maybe you're a scientist. You haven't done an MBA. You don't really understand the ropes of this kind of thing. I don't recommend really personally for founders to do MBAs. I think, frankly, they're a waste of time. But these kind of things are just completely alien. You don't really appreciate going into starting a company, that can be a big hurdle. So that was a really interesting point you made there. I'd love to know as well, kind of, you obviously had a big kind of help from Techstars. It sounded like you really got a leg up and those guys were really good to you. I've heard similar things, obviously, about the accelerator. What did you find hardest in terms of growing over, let's say, the last year, like kind of, again, with a similar question towards fundraising, what was that kind of curveball you were thrown, and what have you found really difficult? It might be, hiring, finding the right people. It might be kind of, pivoting the idea from feedback from customers. What would you say it was?
Is everything an answer here? No, I would say that. I'd say the hardest thing is when you get, so I knew obviously every good thing in life, it ends, it shifts. Techstars is still there for you. RMD for that program, I'm going to say his name. That's the one name I'll say out loud. Matt Kozlov is the one who we cold emailed, and he believed in us and gave us our first check and moved heaven and hell to make sure that we knew how to fundraise. I spent probably at least 3 hours of his time every week. And he's a busy guy. just soaking up as much as I know about investment from him. He's very good at it. He's very good at picking winners. But I think knowing that Techstars was going to be over, I knew I had to start making moves for our company post that. It's like one of the things that and feedback that we got from both customers and VC alike is that the idea is awesome. Build a digitized factory that's building things 20 feet or larger and is self-assembly with, only 10% human intervention to build a full product. That's cool. That's awesome. Amazing, right? You're early. Can you even display even just a part of that? And so for me, it was like, we were exiting the program. We had raised a tiny bit of venture funding. We probably had like about that time, maybe $500,000 of dollars saved up. And it was like, in my mind, I'm like, okay, this is great. The chains are moving. We need to find a home. We're a deep tech company. We have to build a company now, but we also have to build technology. We need a home where we can literally a physical home to build this. It's not a software company where we can all just work from each, from home or whatever. And so having to do homework on the city that we were moving to, right? That would make sense for us. So obviously the US, you have great choices in cities or whatever. But as a first company, first time founder, I think my mind was very much like, I need to be close to where there's access to capital, right? I need people to, if they're going to at least say no to me for 2 months, on the third month, they need to come by and see that we've made physical progress, right? And I'm like, after Techstars, I'm like, where are the places that we could go and find buildings to do that? Like, and we needed, at bare minimum was 20,000 square feet. So we looked at, obviously Los Angeles, because that's where we were at for Techstars. I lived there obviously for other gigs that I was working in rocketry. And I was like, we could, but the dollar signs just aren't big enough for what we want to do. I actually ended up, after doing some homework, I moved us to Berkeley, California. So right next to Silicon Valley, right next to the heart of Silicon Valley, where investors could, like, the idea and the vision that I had, like after just talking to a couple of founders and even investors, was like, we're not pre-product, but we're going to be working on products at a medium to lowish volume, right? So we need a facility that investors can come across literally the Bay Bridge, leave their office, or maybe leave coming from seeing other founders that are building software companies. They should be able to come to our facility. It should be like awesome and pristine, as nice as possible. And they should be like, wow, there's literally like a whole aircraft or rocket being 3D printed at a scale I've never even imagined, with robots that are much bigger than the car just drove through here building this thing, right? Like Silicon Valley is awesome in so many ways, but we're always focused on the software companies. And there's actually the space in the hardware and manufacturing companies, and that ecosystem there, it's small, but it's incredible. Like there's so many companies doing just these massive, amazing things. And I looked at the opportunity, especially with people leaving SF, and my brain quickly did Olu math. And I call it Olu math because it's sometimes flawed, but it's very much a mix of like actual mathematics with like my gut feeling on things. But it was like, my gut feeling was like, people are leaving the Bay Area. They hate it right now. That means there's an opportunity for real estate, right? Maybe I can convince somebody to give me a space at a reduced price because we're a new startup and they don't want to have to, pay vacancy area. So I looked at probably like 50 spaces. We were pretty early. I remember we had like about $500,000 at the time in our bank account, which is not a lot, right? For a down payment, and then also like, having to make monthly payments. But I remember I met a really good real estate developer. And he worked with me and he coached me to speak the language of what people that want to lease their industrial spaces, what they want to hear, what they want to look for and stuff like that. It's kind of like the VC side of things where it's like you're soaking up this information so you can speak their language, right? So for industrial real estate, it's more than just a cute story. You need a little bit of clever bronze to an actual finance to get people convinced that you're a bet to take on. So I remember, I'll wrap it up quickly here, but the landlord that we rented from, I remember I had worn him down for probably 2 months. And they're a pretty big startup that was successful, and they had no need for the space anymore. So they just wanted to make some money on their lease back for it. And so I remember I negotiated a 3-year lease at a pretty low rate for the Bay Area. And they were like, we don't even like know if your company's going to succeed, but we loved like seeing you grow and how you started to go from negotiating one way to another way when you started to understand us and our concerns, that they're like, we were willing to take the bet. So it was really cool to go through that. And that was a really big challenge, especially when you have such little money in the account, because you're taking a bet. The bet of my company is, if it doesn't work out, we now have a huge lease that we have to fulfill for the next and at this point it's like 2.5 years. But the payoff of it was they understood that and they liked us as a company. So they gave us all their office equipment for free. So like desks and stuff like that. They gave us a CNC machine free and a bunch of other equipment to get the deal done. And so it's turned out really well for us. But it was that was a challenge of like, am I going to screw over our company and our dream before we even can get to building the big thing? And it's worked out so far.
I love it. There's so many people. Okay, obviously kind of Elon comes to mind, and Brett Adcock as well. I'm sure you know him. They all have stories where it's like, yeah, we almost died. Our company almost died for real. And that feels like kind of similar in terms of big risk not going to pay off. But what I love, man, about that story is like, you showed adaptability, willing to learn, flexibility, trying to understand someone else, and using it to your own advantage. And I'm sure this is, what your backers like Techstars see in you, right? And thinking about the one person that picked up the phone, I think Matt, you said his name was, kind of almost certainly what he saw in you, right? That's just hustle, that willingness to get things done, and that kind of energy that you bring. Before we wrap up as well, I just want to take some time to talk about the space industry as a whole. And maybe like a bit of a different question here is, I've spoken to, obviously, a lot of your backers will be dedicated to space, and there are a lot of specific space investors out there. But when you talk to a lot of maybe more deep tech investors who look at the space more generally, a lot of them are like, kind of like, why would I even think about space, right? As you made the point earlier, right? I'm looking for a return. Space is not going to be big, supposedly, for the next 10, 20 years is what they say, right? How would you convince someone that is not the case? Like, why is it a good time to invest in space? Coming from the point of view of opportunity cost. So a lot of people might say, climate is the most pressing issue right now. I want to put all of my dollars in climate. Why should they look at space?
Yeah, I'll tell you specifically what we did, and hopefully that answers this question. Because space is a very scary thing. The goalposts keep moving every couple of years. Oh, we're 10 years out. 2 years later, oh, we're 10 years out, right? For investors, I definitely have heard, and I appreciate their concern on this. The way that we've done it, though, is we've looked at it and we're building a very generalized thing, right? The goal of my company, Solideon, is effectively, when we get to space, you can build entire products in space without having people like actually having to touch it. And we mean entire products, we mean like a machine builds something, assembles it, and it's good to use. It's either whether it's a plane to return back to Earth, or to go and explore other planets, or to go build the infrastructure, like you were saying, with energy and such like that. Our goal is to effectively have an autonomous large-scale production factory in orbit or on a celestial body without really needing people to man it. In understanding that, it's an easy pitch for us to investors, because it's like, yes, you might not think space is there in 10, 20 years, but guess what? If we are going to get there, we have to get good at building products on Earth the same way today, right? So there's a lot of space companies that focus on manufacturing, right? They're like, oh, we're going to go put a robot on the end of a rocket and assemble things. And ISAM is awesome, and it's a amazing opportunity. But we've never done that on Earth. We've never built on Earth 100, at least at the scale that we're going after, 20 feet or larger things. We've never built products like that are super autonomous without any human intervention at that size. Like, no one has done that. So how are we going to fund companies to go and do that, right? Like that with a might 20, 10, 15, 20 year return on investment, maybe, right? They're going to encounter so many problems like the rocketry industry, where there was just things that you didn't know until you started to fly it. And so for our company, and the way we convince people is, if we get to that vision, that's awesome. If we don't, we've built a highly autonomous production manufacturing facility that can build basically anything at scale. And that's where you're going to need at space, right? And here are the customers that are willing to pay for it today. And this is how it connects the dots. It's almost like that, that I don't know if you've ever watched those true crime shows where they have like pictures of people and they have like the yarn going between the pictures and like the different ideas and stuff. Like, that is how we pitched. It was like, this is where we're starting. These are the problems on Earth. In space, every industry that is on Earth will need to be copied and pasted. How are you going to build it out? That's why we focus on manufacturing. And so usually that argument makes sense. People have more questions also than they have answers when I say that statement. But But for us, it's like all those things that people are working on in space. I would say, how do you adapt it for Earth to show competency, not just so you can get funding, but so that you can actually make a difference, right, on Earth first, right? Like, and being able to literally build that competency out for space when it's ready. Because the industry is going to take time to get there, but when it does get there, I mean, it's going to be such a sweet place of victory for a lot of us that have dedicated our careers to it. Where you and I, James, we're going to go take a holiday on the moon, right? Or people are going to maybe be able to go and see Mars for a couple months and then come back. Whatever that industry looks like, or maybe we just have bunch of robots that are sent to go mine a bunch of asteroids, and we don't necessarily have a huge presence of humanity in space, but we have our fingerprint with our technology. Whatever it is, that's going to happen. It's just how quickly and how much are you willing to bet on it? And my bet is that if we can make really great products on Earth, we're going to be able to do it in space. And so,
yeah, no, it's absolutely. Again, it's like, I think it is convincing people of the big vision, right? I kind of, a lot of what you said reminded me of what Bezos said as well about space, which is like, I forget the quote exactly, but Earth is like some kind of gem that we need to protect. And by actually taking these kind of processes like manufacturing, like mining and all this stuff out into space, we're protecting Earth for hopefully generations and decades and thousands of years to come. And people who maybe come at it from like the climate angle of like, oh, we need to focus on these problems. Actually, space is a doorway to helping us with like a lot of the problems we see on Earth as well. I think Vinod Khosla as well, the famous investor, said something as well that you kind of you touched on, which is really interesting, which is perhaps going away from common software advice for startups and focusing on, when we talk about hardware, is like build something that has many different applications. So we talked a lot about space today, but as I said earlier, it's like you're building a state-of-the-art manufacturing hub, and that doesn't just have to serve space companies, right? If this space vision turns out to be not as big perhaps as we all thought it would, personally, I know you definitely don't think that that's the case, and I don't as well. We're both very bullish on it. But if that does, turn out to be not as big a market as we thought it would be, you have something amazing on Earth that can be used for the benefit of humanity, which I think is a really interesting angle, and kind of just perhaps flies in the face of common advice that you might get for a startup, which is like, oh, you have to build for a niche, you have to have this kind of rigid vision. Actually having these exit ramps occasionally isn't such a bad idea. So right. yeah, fantastic advice. Also,
I'll just put one last piece here, but everyone also pretends like that Earth isn't a planet in space. Like, if you are building a company on Earth, you're a space company inherently, right? We don't have Earth problems, we have space problems, just geographically on Earth, right? So those aren't two mutually exclusive ideas. I think people need to remember we're all on this quote unquote spacecraft orbiting the sun every year, right? In different ways here. And I think when you have that perspective, you don't think about going to space as we're leaving this world and trying to ditch the problems of Earth. It's like, no, it's actually still connected. We're just geographically somewhere else and trying to make things better for Earth. So I love that. When I started to formulate that perspective, when we started to like build the brand of the company out, I was like, yeah, that resonates with me the most. So, yeah,
I love that. I just don't see it resonating with a lot of people, because a lot of people are quite narrow-minded, and I think that's like a super open-minded, almost philosophical way to look at the problem, which I really like. That's fantastic, mate. Actually, you just told me something there today. I never thought of it like that. I always kind of saw space and Earth separate. Maybe that's a function of like the kind of people I spend time around, but that's really interesting. I'm sure when you tell that to people, you could kind of see it in their eyes when it like connects with them. And it's like, okay, I want you as an investor, or I want you on my team, or I want you on my side kind of thing. It's like, wow, you get it. That's crazy. And in terms of like your company then, Solideon, what do you see the next kind of 5-10 years, in store for you? Because obviously, you're going to try and get as many pilots as you can with customers, get as many customers on board. How do you see the company evolving? And, maybe, obviously you probably don't want to put numbers on it, but how big do you see you guys getting in the next decade or so?
Yeah, totally. So, we built the company, and that's the reason we branded as Solideon, and we kind of came out of stealth mode recently. But we're building effectively the AWS of manufacturing, effectively, where you have this fine set of tools, you can build anything, and one day build a product, and then be able to iterate off of that product very quickly. We're trying to make hardware like software manufacturing, and that's the really key and exciting vision here. So, if I can just like put on my like cool hat here, so to speak, you have this main hub that's Solideon, and under each one of them are specific verticals, and we won't get into that too much publicly today. But really verticals where you go from where the big company that manufactures for a lot of people intakes all this information and understands what it takes to build a full product via large robotics and autonomously, right? And then you go after certain verticals where you go from being a contract manufacturer to actually working with some of the best brands in each vertical to actually build entire products that you sell and put it on the market. What's interesting about that business model now is you still have this manufacturing opportunity open for everyone. But when you understand with the data that we're getting from manufacturing, how to build an even better product, and once again, not parts, I hate when people are like, oh, you're a parts manufacturer. It's like, no, we're building entire products at our facility, especially at that size. And so the idea is when you understand what it takes to build in that vertical, ideally, like, especially with the way that we're building, you can actually go and build products that go and beat anything on the market or should be market leaders. And it shouldn't be, people shouldn't care that 3D printing at its core is what we're using for it. It should just be, we're building a better product that comes in under budget, comes on time or earlier, and is higher performing than anything else on the market. And those verticals, that's what's the exciting piece of that is you can actually go and expand the company to go and build products that are beating everything else, because manufacturing, I think at its core, is really what holds back really some of the big innovation. So not saying we would, but if we wanted to go build a rocket, right? The idea behind our facility, right, or that vertical, if we were to build a rocket, for example, not saying that we would be you hire a team of guys. I'm going to use him as an example. You would hire a team of people who have like almost like an Elon mentality for rocketry, right? For example, you get them in charge of this BU, and then you go build out a highly defined team where they can focus on the product development and making an awesome product as opposed to having to scale production. The production problem has already been solved. You put them on that team and they get to go and compete against other companies right now, right? Where they don't have to wait years to figure out how they're going to build a thing. They know how they're going to build it. They're just playing in the confines around the manufacturing and production. And that to me is exciting because I like to fancy that I'm a smart guy, but I'll let you know that there's people way smarter than me, and getting them to go and build those things, those specific things that they're passionate about with amazing technology. Oh my gosh, you and I are going to see products that people have never been able to build before. And that's the vision of this company, especially when we get to space. Everything that you build in space is just inherently, because of the environment and whatever, is just going to have to look differently. So if you have that common core AWS of manufacturing kind of idea where you're having these tools that can build anything anywhere geographically and adjust for that, I mean, we have an exciting future coming up as humanity if we're able to do that. I think hopefully there's going to be other companies that join in that call to arms in that. And I think when you have what I think will be really cool is I think eventually it'll stop being a space race and it'll be an industrialization race, right? Of how we can adapt to our new into our new settings, and what does that look like for us to build products quicker than anyone else to actually, whether it's for defense, or hopefully it's for peaceful, non-wartime usages. But the idea around being able to go build a team that can just focus on building a really good product as opposed to focusing on scaling manufacturing. I mean, we're going to have a great time as a society if we can do that. So, but team size right now is about 11 people. And we're hoping to scale. I think if you're talking about the 10-year frame, it wouldn't be unnecessary to be at 1,000 people at that point to go and build and scale these kinds of companies that we talk about. So. Yeah.
No, fantastic. And I love, again, you kind of touching on the point of communication being key in terms of, you can have all these smart people. I've met plenty of people like that. I'm sure you have kind of PhDs, scientists, unbelievably smart, but they just lack that kind of, I don't know, maybe you call it ambition, or maybe you'd call it kind of just communication skills to actually convey their ideas. And it does take that person to actually kind of unite under one banner, as Elon has done obviously very, very well. And he's the poster child of this really, and getting them all to kind of focus their efforts on one mission. And when you have the right team who are all dedicated on this one goal and they're super smart as well, you can achieve crazy things, right? Final thing, I guess, final question would be, if you wanted kind of the listeners to leave with one, piece of advice, maybe not as a promo for your company, obviously, you've done a great job of kind of explaining exactly what you guys do. But if you maybe one piece of advice for like a budding entrepreneur who particularly wants to get into the hardware space, what would you say to them?
I would say spend time with the people that, two things, spend time with your customers early. Don't try to sell them. Just have a conversation and really listen to what they're having problems with, and understand their lingo, and spend time with investors, and the same thing, understand the language that they speak and what they're really working for, and don't be friends with them because they might write a check, or they might have you as a you might have them as an end user. Actually, just make friends with them. Genuinely, just be a kind person, and know them, get to know them, know their hearts, right? I will tell you this: it's easier to write a check for someone that you like and versus someone that is just begging you for money. And so there's that. And then lastly, spend time with other entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs that have been there. Open that network up. It's gonna help you. You don't know who can refer you to things, or just give you even better advice than hopefully than what I'm giving you. But go with people who've done it, and then formulate your opinions on what entrepreneurism is, because it's this journey is as my investors say, it's at least a 10-year journey, and and none of us know how that journey, all that journey shapes up very specifically for each one of us. So the three things to recap: understand and talk with people in VC and understand who they are. Talk with people that are your end customers. Don't try to sell them. And lastly, like I said, go meet other entrepreneurs and build that network. So.
Amazing advice. I think I was on a call yesterday, actually, even beyond kind of building a startup. But when you jump on that call with someone and you're open to having a chat and exchanging ideas, and it becomes painfully aware within 5 minutes that they're trying to sell you something, and it's man, this is just such a mood killer. And it's it's very difficult to build a relationship off of that, particularly when you're meeting for the first time. Which is why I think that point about trying to get to know people and trying to be friends with them before you actually go in for the kill and off money and this and that is actually a really crucial step that's overlooked. Final point I want to make as well, because you kind of brought it up a number of times, and I've heard this from other kind of space founders I know, which is you never seem to talk of it, which I really enjoy. You never seem to talk of it as it's us versus them, or it's a competition, or we're gonna kill the competition and stuff like that you hear from other founders. You've used the word community, I think 2 or 3 times, which is really interesting, and I've heard before. So I just want people to leave at that point as well. It's if we're going to build a future in space, it needs to be a community. It needs to be a joint effort. It isn't us versus them. It's everyone working together in harmony. But Olu, thanks so much for your time, man. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and take care and all the best.
Cheers, James. Talk to you soon.